Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site, bettingangle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, as more news drops about this gambling scandal, one person is at more risk than others, right? One celebrity, one player is at more risk than others. It might not be readily apparent, right? Just understand that about 2 years ago, there was a video on an online forum from Matt Berkey, who is a professional poker player, right? The guy's a stud. And he was talking about a poker series of games taking place in Las Vegas as well as LA involving Chauncey Billups. Now, this was 2 years ago, right? And he said that, his friends and elite poker players tend to know other hardcore elite poker players. Played in some of the games and felt they were rigged, right? Felt they were dirty. That guys who barely knew how to play poker were cleaning up and it looked like they had an unfair edge, right? So, let me highlight how serious the charges are against Chauncey Billups. Because if what Berkey said was true, Billups was involved in a series of games. And let me point out that, it's one thing to attend a game, right? You're just another gambler at the game. You might even be a mark, right? If you showed up to a game and, it's rigged, well, you're the victim, right? The rules are set up to protect people like you, right? You weren't trying to defraud others. You were there as a poker player trying to win money, right? Just understand, Chauncey might be on the other side. The side where he's bringing people to the game, or he's allowing his name to be used at the game to lure people in. The key question is, was Chauncey just a player? Or was Chauncey getting a cut of what the people he lured in bet? Right, folks? That's a big distinction, because understand, if we're to believe the indictments, the games were really exercises in fraud masquerading as poker. In other words, there were machines that could read the cards. People were wearing contact lenses or other lenses where they could look at markings on the card that weren't visible to the normal eye. Right? People were getting information at the table about the cards held by others. We call it poker. Folks, that wasn't poker. That was a fraud setup where people were lured into a game thinking that they were playing with a celebrity, right? When in actuality, the game was set up to make them the victims, to take their money and then to have that bounty split with the other co-conspirators. So let me tell you how serious it is. You had a show on Vegas Stats and Information Network. This is a must-watch segment. The show was Gil Alexander's show, called A Numbers Game, right? It aired on Thursday. He has a portion of that Thursday show where he brings in Bill Krakenberger, a Vegas gambler, right? And Bill's on the show, and the news, wasn't quite clear at that time about what exactly the indictment alleged. So Bill was basically trying to stand up for Chauncey Billups, right? His argument was, okay, look, maybe Chauncey was, just another patsy at the poker game like everyone else, right? Just because an athlete is playing poker doesn't mean that athlete, knows the game's not legit. Doesn't mean that athlete's trying to defraud others, right? The athlete is just another participant. But then Gil Alexander, who is savvy, he low-keyed this. But because Vegas Stats and Information Network attracts savvy gamblers, right? It's a gambling media outlet. The people who watch VSiN, it's called, are more likely to know the line than the general public. They're more likely to know who's playing who, right? They know who the favorites are. They know who the underdogs are, right? Informed crowd. So understand, Alexander, who's extremely savvy, right? Redskin fan, used to be a very big-time DJ here in the Bay Area in California. Alexander understood that all he had to do was present what he had, while, not immediately jumping to conclusions on people. But after Krakenberger said, look, maybe Chauncey was just there, it doesn't mean that he understood that the game wasn't on the up and up. Crack actually said, Chauncey being there doesn't mean that Chauncey deliberately lured people there hoping to get a cut of their money that they were going to lose at an uneven game. But then Alexander played the Matt Berkey tape from 2 years ago, where Berkey talked about a seemingly crooked series of poker games involving Chauncey Billups. Right, folks? That video has been in the public domain for 2 years. So after Alexander played that tape, which it was clear Bill Krakenberger did not know existed, when they got back in the studio, Krakenberger, who tried to just roll with it, looked shaken. I encourage anyone to look at the film, right? Krakenberger, a gambler, understood that if what Berkey was saying was correct, then Chauncey Billups was an active participant in the ongoing multi-million-dollar fraud. Right? We're hearing that at least $7 million was taken from victims at these rigged poker games. Right? So, gamblers, when they hear the story, and then when they hear that it was an ongoing series of poker games, right? Ongoing. And when, you find out that Chauncey Billups is there, right? I'm just telling you, folks, it's a light switch. Either Chauncey's just another victim attending this series of games, or Chauncey is getting a cut of the money they're taking from the other gamblers. And I don't mean by winning the games himself, right? Rigged games, they have a rake. If he got part of the rake on an ongoing business, he is really bad off. Let me point out, too, that Michael Franchise, a former capo in the Colombo family, who has gone straight and is here online. Right? I need for folks to understand how mind-blowing YouTube is. Right? You have people like Sammy the Bull Gravano here online telling you about what happened when he was in the mafia. Same thing with Michael Franchise. Right? And so just understand, he is talking about the feds having 3,000 messages. He believes that the feds had an informant. Right, folks? If that's true, that's devastating to the indicted. Right? Understand, too, Michael Franchise was indicted himself 7 times. Right? He was involved with sports agent Norby Walters back in the day. This is a guy who knows what he's talking about. Right? If the feds had an informant involved in this rigged game long enough to generate 3,000 messages, then Chauncey Billups has big problems. Right? One of the things I don't like with the way this is reported is you have different sets of crimes. Right? The NBA, its players are only involved in a subset, according to the indictment. Right? Damon Jones, there's overlap. But just understand, how do I put this? Terry Rozier is accused of underperforming so that unders on him hit. Right? Now that's bad. That's bad. But Chauncey Billups, who is a head coach in the NBA, who is an NBA Hall of Famer, right, who's a current head coach, and that's the worst part. It's not like he's retired, right? They claim Kevin Garnett has some involvement. Kevin Garnett might be a patsy, right? Kevin Garnett might be an innocent victim who showed up and didn't realize that the game was rigged, right? But Chauncey Billups, if Matt Berkey is correct, and Chauncey was involved in this for 2 years, minimum, right? If the FBI can show that Chauncey was getting a piece of the action of the money that people lost at the games, and I don't mean by winning hands. I'm talking about if Chauncey's getting an outside cut, if he's one of the organizers of these games, then he, to me, is in really bad shape. Understand, too, the feds have a much higher success rate in terms of getting convictions than do state prosecutors. Right? So this is major. We want to pretend that they were playing poker games. They weren't. They were involved in some setup that looked like a poker game that was fraudulent. Right? This is a different series of events than just renting out your mansion so gamblers use it to play poker. No, this is a setup that involved, telling people at the table what cards the other folks had. Right? This is fraud involving the defrauding of people of millions of dollars. Right? Matt Berkey was on TV recently on the Pat McAfee show, talking about how some of his friends lost six figures at these poker games. Right? Understand, too many people are involved. Right? You have, at least 24 people involved. Right? Someone is going to try to cut a deal. Right? You might not even need someone to squeal. If you have an informant and you have tape recordings or text messages. Right? This is serious. I'm wondering what Chauncey Billups' attorney is going to say. Right? Because if Chauncey was at 2 years worth of these poker games, it would be hard for anyone to believe that, Chauncey didn't know what was going on. The other thing, too, is when you're talking about these executive poker games, folks, a lot of money is being bet. Unless Chauncey Billups is operating at world-class level, right? Unless he's Phil Ivey or Doug Polk or Matt Berkey, right? Unless he's World Series of Poker level, right? There's a possibility that we might hear that Chauncey lost a lot of money at these events, right? Now, that's if Chauncey's a victim, right? Which would be devastating for the NBA because crime families are involved. In other words, Chauncey would owe the money to some crime families. Now, if Chauncey doesn't owe anyone the money and isn't a good poker player, that's your worst case scenario. That means that Chauncey was one of the principals of this fraud game that defrauded people out of more than $7 million. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. Again, the show from Thursday, right? It's 10/24/25. This is a Friday. The show from yesterday, 10/23/2025, with Bill Krakenberger. Right? It's Gil Alexander's A Numbers Game on Vegas Stats and Information Network. What I want you to do is to listen to Bill when he first comes on the show. And he's basically saying, look, okay, maybe these basketball players got fooled into, participating in games where, they were being ripped off by a crooked game. Right? He literally says, I don't think Chauncey Billups, lured people in and then, did so with the idea that he would get a cut on what they lost. Then they go to the Matt Berkey film. When they come back, Krakenberger, who's usually loquacious, right? He's usually talkative, is shaken. Right? The minute you see the Matt Berkey film, you understand Billups' involvement might be extensive. We'll find out. Right? But let's just say the Matt Berkey film is so shocking that it changes everything. Let me hear your thoughts in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.